All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to another MassMedic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the medtech industry in New England through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Today, we have an awesome webinar brought to you by our friends at Novalee and Blue Bridge Technologies. We're going to be talking about the new regulations that went into place for cyber devices and best practices around that. So we have lots of exciting information today. Before I turn it over to our moderator, just a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, so anyone who registers for the webinar will receive a copy of the video on demand and also the slides. So you'll receive that after the webinar. Additionally, there is going to be time for Q&A. So as questions occur to you, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer those. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Joe Madden from Novalee. Please take it away, Joe.
Great, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, MassMedic, for hosting this. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about my organization first, Novalee. We're a cybersecurity risk management firm. What we provide is an intelligent automated system that's going to help you manage your cybersecurity risk. Our solution, Select Evidence, it really automates the continuous monitoring of vulnerabilities and the identification of the related mitigations while giving the opportunity to generate live reports for the regulatory authorities that you're choosing to market to. So I'm going to ask each of the other speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So Catherine.
Hello, I'm Catherine McEnroe. I joined Novalee just over 4 years ago as quality manager and now moved to customer success manager this year. I have extensive experience in risk management, quality systems, customer quality. My particular focus is with Novalee's customers, helping them get the maximum value that they can out of our range of cybersecurity solutions. Hand you over to Garrett.
Thanks, Catherine. My name is Garrett Cody. I'm the CEO and founder of Blue Bridge Technologies, which has been around for 17 years. We specialize in regulated system and software development as a professional services company. Deep specialism in full cycle end-to-end development of software as a medical device, software in a medical device, including AI and ML, with the full QA, RA, and taking it from submission or back from submission to concept to development. And we accelerate time to market for our clients, as well as accelerate the quality system development for our clients and the talent development. Clients range from startups to large med tech and large pharma clients.
Great, thank you both. So we'll get right into the content. So we're going to talk a little bit about the implementation of 524B of the FTC Act, which makes cybersecurity requirements mandatory. And FDA has been all over saying that this is now the law and this is something that's a mandate. So we'll talk a little bit about the 4 big buckets that things are lumped into. So designing your processes to ensure cybersecurity, making sure that you've got a plan to monitor post-market vulnerabilities, providing your SBOM, what that means, and including the elements for open source, commercial, and off-the-shelf software, and then your plan really for updating and patching post-market to address the known vulnerabilities and those vulnerabilities that come up through the product's life. The term, we hear a lot now is cyber device, and that's really defined by, I won't read all the text there, but the key here is to make sure that your devices that have the ability to connect are really now required to be covered by the Act. And FDA is really going here for what is foreseeable for the device to be connected. They've used an example at a recent conference where they said a manufacturer had said they had a USB port that they disabled, and they used that to upload any new firmware into the device. but they said it wasn't really connected because they've disabled it. Well, FDA, responded back by saying, hey, look, there is the ability, the foreseeable ability for that device to connect through that USB port. And it was actually kind of funny. There was a tester on the panel with FDA, and they said, show me a disabled USB port and I'll show you access to your device. So the FDA really is trying to make sure that you're addressing not only the devices that are connected, but the devices that have the foreseeable ability to be connected. When you think about the overall guidance document, which is kind of the how you're going to do things, 524 is what needs to be done. Those 4 buckets that we talked about at the very beginning, and really the guidance document is giving you help and options on how that can be done. So we won't have time to go through all of the sections in the guidance document. We'll try to hit some of the high points, some of the gotcha elements that might catch you, and really share a little bit more about the best practices as you're going through the development life cycle for your products. So what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Garrett, and then we'll step through the slides as we go and share. So Garrett, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so many of the audience might be very familiar with this diagram. Comes straight out of the guidance for design controls from the FDA. I guess as the digital health space has evolved, we've direct experience of trying to bring in mobile and cloud people into this world, and sometimes it can be quite an adjustment. And sometimes when we're trying to educate and bring people familiar with those new technologies, more familiar with the more traditional design control and quality systems approach, it can be an eye-opener. They open the design controls document, and the first thing they see is it hasn't been updated since 1997. And the use of the word waterfall there, which can kind of be sometimes a dirty word for people that are used to working in a very dynamic, agile environment. But as the FDA have been rethinking their approach to cyber, they acknowledge that they need to be a lot more dynamic themselves. And as we all know, it's an endless game of cat and mouse. So while the FDA are asking companies to keep abreast of the latest and greatest guidance in this manner, they themselves are becoming a little bit more responsive, so that the cadence of release of documents is not going to be kind of like what you see here, which is the design controls document, which is, for those who don't know, it's just the basic principles of making sure that a product is engineered and developed so that it is ultimately safe and effective, with principles such as validation, verification, design inputs, design outputs, and reviews as well. So what we're trying to deal with now is, with all of this new, very rich guidance on cyber, how do we integrate that into our quality management system? How do we absorb these new obligations without ending up with, let's say, a bloated quality management system? And how do we bring all of the diverse subject matter experts that are kind of required to all sing from the same hymn sheet? Do you want to go on to the next one there, Joe? So, some of the answer lies in blending a variety of different approaches. So one of the things that the FDA has done a really good job on is, making sure that the cyber guidance that has just come out is quite synergistic and aligns with the software guidance as well, still aligns with the risk as well. But there's a multiplicity of other aspects, such as usability, clinical, basic safety for physical products, and also, of course, the software development lifecycle. So there's a lot to keep aligned, and they've done a good job, to be fairness. Of course, the QMS remains foundational in all of this, to support all of this, and we just put in it's kind of a mix of bringing all those together in, let's say, the old and the new, using agile practices, but also more of the traditional kind of waterfall phase gate approaches that are called for in the design approach. But really what we're trying to do in all of it is make sure that the senior subject matter experts are striving to bottom out definition, to get ahead of things, to make sure that as things are being implemented, any ad hoc decisions are really being kept to a minimum. We do realize that's quite hard for some startups where they're trying to get things together, but it also is very hard for large companies as well, as all of these life cycles get more complex, and there's a lot more to think about as well. Next slide, Joe.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess first of all, first thing we want to cover is really risk management activities. So one of the key practices and one of the key guidance in the guidelines is to document your risk management activities. And for FDA submission, it's really all about showing them what you're doing, what you know about your device. So it's documentation, document. You will already be carrying out your device cybersecurity risk management, but this new paradigm requires this really expanded approach. So you really need to have a plan in place to amalgamate and gather all this information that you're going to need to submit to the FDA. You're going to be including in pre-market submissions, you're going to be including things like threat modeling, cybersecurity risk assessment, software bill of materials, component support information, vulnerability assessment, the unresolved anomaly assessment. So as I said, these are going to be an integral part of the risk assessment process. You're going to need to bring this information into your risk assessment process, demonstrate that you really know your device, you're considering all the cybersecurity risks, and you're really looking at the entire supply chain. So it's not just the device, it's manufacturing, it's deployment, it's third-party software, interoperation with other devices, and all the maintenance and update activities that will need to happen over time. And really, ultimately, trying to defend if a deficiency does appear, and trying to defend a deficiency without a comprehensive risk management process is going to be very, very difficult. Next slide, Joe. So next, just a quick look at the scope changes. And there is this scope has been expanded for the requirements for cybersecurity risk management. And just because your device has been exempt from a 510K doesn't mean that you're exempt from this guidance. So as an example, if your device is class 1, you may not have been responsible for design controls, but now if there's software and it's automated, that exemption to design controls no longer exists. So whether your device is class 1 or class 2, 510K required or 510K exempt, or you are taking another submission pathway, it is likely that these new requirements are applicable to your device and you're going to need to provide the outline documentation. Of course, if you have any doubts, you need to check with the regulatory consultant, or you can reach out to the FDA. And with the system review happening now as part of the E-Star system, it's important to have all the required information in place. So next slide. So talk briefly about risk management. First I mentioned was threat modeling. So FDA recommends that pre-market submissions now include threat modeling documentation. That needed to demonstrate how the risks are assessed, how the controls are implemented for the system, and that you've addressed all questions of safety and effectiveness. Now, there are several methodologies or combination of methodologies that you can use for threat modeling, but really what's key to this is understanding your device system and software architecture, and that's crucial because you need to choose the methodology to align with your process and device type. Ultimately, when you complete your submission, you're going to have to provide that rationale for the methodologies that you've selected. So, along with deciding what threat modeling you're going to actually use, you're going to have to prove that you understand why it's relevant to your device and to your software. And you need to be able to explain this choice objectively. And again, it's similar with risk management. If you have a deficiency and if you need to consider a problem, then it will be almost impossible to defend or rationalize your decisions with the FDA if you don't have a threat model, if you haven't determined who's likely to exploit your devices, what vulnerabilities are there, and how you're going to manage them. So it really is going to be an integral part of the risk management and submission activities for your device. So next, Gareth's going to outline some of the robust software development practices that also support risk management.
Thanks, Catherine. So one thing that's common, that's coming out of both the new software guidance and the cyber guidance is the request for explaining the system in a diagrams format. So accompanying with explanatory text for both cyber and software. So what we're seeing is new systems scale in complexity. An over-reliance on just pure documents can be challenging as well. So we're looking at, let's say, using a data and information model, which invokes systems engineering types approaches, where you actually can really bring together an area where both the requirements, the structure, and the behavior are co-located, so everybody can get on the same page, even though when I'm saying get away from documents a little bit to understand what you're engineering as well. So one of the techniques, for instance, in there is a stakeholder analysis, which is very synergistic with what the FDA are asking for you to do on the cyber side. Basically, stakeholder analysis, or some of you might be familiar with a use case diagram, how people integrate or interact and are served by the system. So you can really understand the architecture componentry, how it interacts with all of the different stakeholders, and make sure you've got all of the needs of all of those stakeholders is a really critical aspect of the whole holistic approach that you need to take as well. So, but basically, as Catherine is saying, the FDA will be scanning your entire architecture to make sure that it's the security architecture will need to be expressed with different views, so that you, like the stakeholder analysis, you're looking at different prisms to really make sure you're going to the four corners of what the system needs to do, from a global systems view, multi-patient harm view, updatability and patchability view, and using security use cases as well. Next slide, Joe. So some people can get a little bit overawed by what is design controls. When you have anything with a software component, there's basically 12 aspects to it here, right through from planning, design inputs, design outputs, review, all of the regular things that you've seen before, verification, validation. But critically, all of these aspects here that we show a rough mapping between the CFR and the 1345 standard. But basically, you will see these clauses invoked throughout the standard, which helps you understand really when you need to bring it into the overall product development life cycle. And it really orientates you so that we all know that it's not linear, so things will be back and forth. But and there's also, beyond the design controls, there's other aspects of the QMS that are invoked, not just the narrower side of design controls, CAPA, product development, supplier controls, all of those good practices associated that are invoked from the quality management system really come into their own. But I think it's just a useful slide. Some people don't know the entirety of what design controls is, but that is it should be serve as a useful kind of slide for you. Next slide, Joe. So one thing that's really useful, we've seen a number of, let's say, deficiency letters where some of our smaller clients have been kicked back from the FDA, and they're really a collection of processes that are whose main objective is to reduce the severity and a number of vulnerabilities throughout the life cycle. So, whereas they don't, like a lot of the time, the FDA always uses language where you don't have to use this, but unless you are a company with a real super deep pedigree in cyber, this is a very useful template. And as we said, we've seen a number of different deficiency letters that are really, up to October at least, are very prescriptive in where they want you to address certain issues, and they invoke all of the aspects of the software or the secure product development framework. So it's but one thing, again, back to Catherine, the threat model is foundational to all of this. And again, you have to provide traceability between the threat model, cybersecurity risk, SBOM, and testing documentation as well. So one of the other things about risk management, we're obviously trying to extend, as I was saying, you don't want to try and bloat your quality management system. You want to extend it to cover cyber. but they do ask for a distinct risk approach. Even though you can extend your current safety, basic safety risk assessments and processes, there's a very good useful standard that TIOR 45 from AAMI, which helps to extend your risk management process. But again, they want it to be distinct and separate, because the nature and the scope of the harm for cyber is different, and the risk assessment factors might be different as well, and they extend beyond general device as well. So they do want to see something different as well. So the other thing to say is that, you know, it's not a direct mapping, but it's useful to think that software security risk management is probably closer to your design inputs. Security architecture, where they're asking for different views of the system, is closer to outputs, and the mapping for cybersecurity testing is more for your verification side. But there's some very good standards there. The UL standard and the ISO standard there really give good guidance on how you will really test for malware, malinformed input, structured pen tests, software weaknesses, static code analysis, and static binary analysis. So it's a really good template that you can use to overlay on your existing quality management system. On to the next slide, Joe.
So a couple of things you would have seen in the previous slide is talking about third-party components and the third-party component lifecycle management. And I guess this is an area where up to now you don't have direct control, you don't have direct visibility with third-party components. But as part of demonstrating compliance with design controls and adding to your QMS system and your submission, you need to support supply chain risk management as well for all of these components. So whether it's software developed by a device manufacturer, proprietary software that's licensed, whether it's obtained from third parties, open source, it really should be assessed for cybersecurity risk, because ultimately, when you're using that component, it's part of your device. You need to understand what it's doing, what the risks that may be induced by using that, and you need to be able to manage the risks going forward as well. Source code itself is not subject, doesn't need to be required in pre-market submissions, but again, you need to document the plans that you have for managing the life cycle of this component in your device. Go on to the next slide, Joe. So a key tool for managing your software supply chain is a comprehensive software bill of materials, and that has to be included as part of your submission. Now, the FDA asks you to submit an SBOM, but it doesn't specify a specific industry standard for SBOMs, such as Cyclone DX or SPDX. But you have to consider this, that for submission, you're going to be providing evidence of safety and security risk assessment for every identified vulnerability in each software component. And the risk controls that you've implemented need to address those vulnerabilities and whether they're existing, and whether the controls that you have in place are existing controls, or whether you need to put more compensating controls in place. So in addition to knowing your software component name, the version, the manufacturer, you also need to know the asset where that software component resides, the asset within your device. Any known vulnerabilities, as we said, we've mentioned that a number of times. But additionally, you need to be able to demonstrate the software level of support that's provided through monitoring, whether it's monitoring obviously internally on your device, and you bringing the maintenance update activities from the software component manufacturer. So ultimately, the software component manufacturer is responsible for the updating of that activity, but you need to ensure that your device has the appropriate updates. Again, we're talking about lifecycle support. So this is third-party component lifecycle. So you also need to find out and know the software component's end of support date. So if your software bill of materials doesn't include all these 7 data points, you're going to have to add that relevant data as an addendum to the submission documentation. So it really is the choice of the tool that you use to generate a software bill of materials is really going to be critical to, to help you in your cybersecurity risk assessment. Next slide, Joe. So with the management of vulnerabilities, you are going to find some unresolved anomalies, and this is another key part of what you need to understand about the risks or the cybersecurity risks of your device. The FDA will require that all unresolved anomalies with security impacts have to be addressed. And anomalies that are present in the device and the product at the time of submission have to be documented and included in the submission. So, for example, there could be a software anomaly that occurs sporadically. And from a software risk perspective, it's a low risk, but potential impact of a threat coming along, deliberately seeking and exploiting that anomaly has to be considered and addressed in the context of the asset within your device and your safety and patient safety. So you're still going to need to assess the potential impact on patient safety for all these unresolved anomalies and consider that information that is needed for submission. And again, the criteria, the rationales for addressing the resulting anomalies with security impacts has to be provided as part of your documentation in the pre-market submission. Again, it's really, we're trying to say is really demonstrating, understanding your product, understanding what the software component is doing in your device, understanding what the vulnerability or the anomaly can do for your device for patient safety, potentially impacting patient safety in the future. So next slide.
Thanks, Catherine. So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA has done a really good job making sure these various different new guidances are quite consistent with each other. And, you know, they can be orientated by the different phases of design input, design output. This one is an example of a life cycle approach that's done by, again, AAMI, who do really excellent stuff, where they're mapping out the life cycle obligations. This is just for human factors, the processes and the activities on the midstream, where they are in the overall life cycle from pre-design control right to validation and submission. And then at the bottom, a lot of the documentation set that supports each of those activities. This has to be done for all of the different aspects. Cyber, of course, which is the topic of today, but it also has to be done for clinical, hardware. Of course, risk management is the common thread through it all, but a number, and then of course the software lifecycle as described in 62304. So what they are all asking for is making sure that you're doing an awful lot of upfront. You're shifting left. You're trying to do a lot more in that pre-design control phase, so that you've good definition going forward. You're anticipating what's ahead. So again, you're not lifting floorboards, because the overhead of design controls can be significant. So if there's a few different changes halfway through, it can be quite disruptive to the system as well. So next slide, Joe. So what we're seeing here is there's new lenses, and to me, cyber reminds me of what human factors engineering was like 15 years ago. In order for the FDA to really influence manufacturers to take human factors seriously, whereby they really had to, the onus was on manufacturers to really make sure the usability aspects were considered. So use error, it was not, the designs were not cleansed of use error. That became designated as a non-conformity. So when that was enshrined in the regulations, it really drove people to take human factors a lot more seriously. And you can see the whole thing with cyber now and the right to refusal. There's a real serious emphasis on it as well. We would contend that to bring all of these together, like the threat model, it's a great diagrammatic view, but we would be proponents of pushing out the whole system view from a number of different lenses. And one of the greatest challenges is in all of digital health, as we find they're complex systems, product management and definition of what you're trying to build, what you're not going to build, what you have to interface for, getting the requirements right is a persistent challenge in all of these large-scale projects as well. So again, we're emphasizing planning and upfront requirements engineering and using these holistic system engineering type tools. When we use the word system engineering, we're also, you can interchange that with holistic, just trying to get the macro view first before you drop down into the basement on each of the particular areas. So the use of tools such as SysMil, maybe people are familiar with, or UML. And there's a big art to know when to turn on design controls, and then also how deep to go on certain aspects as well. That's usually a lot of the imponderables that a lot of people struggle with as it's their first time going through these exercises or these product development flows. If you want to go on to the next one, Joe. So this is just further again, straight from the software guidance, where they're getting really specific about what they want to see in diagrams. They want to be expressed in diagrams. So having a diagram where the architecture is described and the adjacent systems as well, and the requirements, how the requirements meet those how support those are, the requirements implementations are supported by those architectural modules. But basically, the FDA will be continuously scanning your architecture to see if the device provides and implements all of the security objectives throughout that architecture. And the security objectives broadly include authenticity, including integrity, authorization, availability, confidentiality, secure and timely updates. So that will be always reviewed through when you're submitting all of these diagrams and documentation. And Joe, do you want to go to the next one? So yeah, so this is where the new standards, just specifically for software, the documentation level. We all know documentation and design scales with risk, higher risk. They want more considered design and more detailed documentation. And the structure of what they're asking for has deviated from previous. Gone are the levels of concern, but they've stratified things into two basic categories of risk based on your pre-mitigated risk. Basically, basic is one, and then enhanced is the other. Obviously, you have to develop enhanced documentation, more considered design. You have to, for enhanced design, you have to drop into a software design specification, which is a very detailed description of each of the units and how they interact. But they also ask for that a software detailed design is done even if the product is basic, but they will not be reviewing it. So everything needs an architecture chart now. When there was 62304 for a very basic low level of concern, they didn't require an architecture for 62304, which was kind of a crazy nonsense. That is gone. They've also given a lot of emphasis on what they want to see in a software description, which absolutely overlaps with what the cyber are looking for as well. And real, as we spoke about, specificity around the architecture. They also want to see adjacent infrastructure or functions that are outside of your system. You could be potentially delegating controls into adjacent third party, but you have to get very specific around about where they are. You have to really detail out how those controls are delegated to other manufacturers, hospital infrastructure, or cloud providers. And then also you really need to make sure that the architecture, of course, is consistent with the threat model. That will be an obvious problem if your threat model and your architecture are inconsistent. So I think that's it, Joe, from me.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine and Garrett. We do have some time for questions. Want to make sure that you please post the questions in the question and answer section, so that'll come through over to the team for addressing. I'll do is kind of open the floor a little bit with a question for Garrett. Can you expand a little bit more on the different models, the waterfall, the scrum, the fall, or should we just be looking at a straight V model for our processes?
It's a huge topic of discussion. Basically, what we would say for large scale agile. The larger a project gets, you just cannot get away from extensive planning, which regular agile may not call for. But also what we would say is what's important is before you're entering into the project, you really have to really have more of the architecture laid out and more of the, now we all know as you start developing, things do change, but really you need to strive in your planning phases for a level of completeness of both the requirements and the architecture to be at 70 or 80% before you start developing. So that, and paying attention, deep attention to anything that is attributable to risk and anything that is attributable or has a direct connection with your intended use. Thereafter, you can use a combination of the agile methodologies, the daily scrums, the ceremonies, all of that's excellent for collaboration, but being guided by a higher level system engineering type overview or that more holistic view of the system. So you can't really get to, there can be religious wars around this, but you really need to accommodate both, you know, a number of different, the old and the new.
Perfect. Thank you. And what we'll try to do is we'll be answering all these questions in a follow-up. So we'll share all the answers because we won't necessarily have time to get all the questions that are coming in. Also, we will be, I think Nicole had mentioned it, we will be sharing the slides and the content after the presentation. So let me see if we have another question here. Sorry, I'm scrolling through the questions and looking to answer one here. So we're about halfway through the development of our product. What should we do now? What's the most critical thing for us to do now? And I guess I'll open that up to both Catherine and to Garrett to offer comments.
Lead with that, Catherine. I can follow up if possible.
You're on mute, Catherine.
Yeah, that's a question. What to do now? I get, my take would be, I suppose the threat modeling to me is extremely important because you really, really need to understand how your device is structured. You know, what are you trying to protect? You obviously, other than customer safety, you know, or patient safety is obviously the paramount, but there are other factors that kind of other layers of the device operation that go towards making, you know, creating that patient safety, and really understanding your device, understanding your threat model, what assets are you trying to protect? What is it? And again, it really just depends on the device, whether it's big or small, what sort of data is being transferred, what activity the device is creating, what it's interacting with the patient as well. So really threat modeling to me is the first thing to think about and say, you know, to be able to understand the structure of your product. And again, it may not be possible to do it fully if you're still in development, but you need to understand the core because everything is really related to how the potential for vulnerabilities and threats and exploits with your core product, I think, is really where to start.
Just to add to that, Catherine, absolutely. The threat model is foundational, but yeah, I would so really educate yourself on what a good threat model looks like, or seek external help. But then look at the guidance and look at the secure product development framework. What are the subsequent phases in there? Because we know that that's what, you know, the FDA is going to be looking at by default. If you don't propose something different, if you don't have that pedigree, look at that secure product development framework, from risk management to the security architecture and the testing. There's a lot of really great guidance in that, but foundational to all of that is the threat model.
Great, thank you for that. There is another question that came in, and again, I think I'll open it to both you and to Catherine. So when you're developing your product and you're trying to organize all of the data and all the information to align with the regulations, this is a bit overwhelming for an organization that's just starting out, are there any tools that you'd recommend to help manage all of this?
There isn't one tool that magic wands this away. You still have to believe in the process that, educate yourself. It's people, process and tools. So the people really need to get on top of the standards, either internal or external. You use something. We have had some success for just product using application lifecycle management systems, and there's a number of them out there, but also using model-based systems engineering. Now, they're heavy tools, so unless you've got a lot of complexity, they're probably not worth too much of the investment. But also, I think there's a slight tolerance from the FDA for startups that if your plans and your DHF runs a little bit ahead of your quality management system, as long as there's concerted effort to comply with these guidances, there's a little bit more tolerance for startups as well. But you can, particularly software engineers are really trying to automate away all of these obligations, but really there's no one tool. Even electronic QMS, they're good on their own right, but they generally don't serve the product well, and you need application lifecycle management tools for that. So it's a huge topic, but there isn't one tool that does it all.
Okay. Going through here real quick, looking at other questions. So there's a bunch that are coming in. So thanks everybody for sharing. We'll try, like I said, we'll try to address a few more as we go, as time permits. But we will be, any of the questions that aren't answered, we'll be getting together and sending that out following. I guess I'll keep on with the tools idea. There's a question that came in that said, is there a list of tools or a list of suggested tools that we shouldn't be using in the processes?
If there is, I don't know of a list that you shouldn't be. Yeah, I think just a balanced approach about tools. Again, really, you really have to make sure that your people or you've access to the expertise and the experience first and foremost, then back it up with the processes. Make sure you've got to optimize before you automate. So you have to start making sure that as you're rolling, if you're building the wings as you're flying, that the processes are a bit more resilient, robust, and optimized and refined before you go into tooling. We've done this a couple of years, about 7 years ago. We tried to implement and use a tool to insert order and discipline and compliance before the people really knew what was behind this initiative, and it was a failure. So I really think you need to focus on people and processes before you get too preoccupied with tools, and then you do need a big volume of kind of submissions or episodes of product development to justify some of these tools. So you can look to external providers like yourself, Joe, that have a lot of this tooling, because tooling can be, design controls is burdensome enough without trying to lob on tools, and they tend to be large enterprise grade things, so they can swamp smaller companies. I've heard the phrase that you brought in a cow, and you're trying to just manage a cow in a room when I only wanted a glass of milk. So the configuration and the deployment of some of these tools can be so overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of having a tool as the answer is a tool is a tool. It'll help you along the way. But Garrett's point about having your process in place first is really critical, because when you're talking about automation, you got to make sure that you're comfortable with your process, you understand what your process, and you know what the outputs are going to be before you start to automate it. So you have to make sure you're verifying the outputs out of your tool anyways. So it's a nice closed circle. There are definitely tools out there. You know, I promised Nicole I wouldn't do an infomercial, but there are definitely tools out there. Novalia does have a couple of tools that provide a lot of support in the risk management aspects for FDA. I will be following up to share more information about those tools as well. So there is another question that came in, and I'll open this maybe to Catherine and to Garrett. A lot of it is tied to the risk and the threat model, but a person has asked, how do you decide which of the threat models to use or to implement when you're developing your product?
It's hard to know what to say. There's different threat models. I think what you're trying to protect will kind of define what the model is. I mean, if you're trying to protect privacy or private information, you may go for something like Linden. If you're trying to protect data and what's the word, not activity, but actions that the tool is taking, you're going to look at something like Stripe, because you don't want the data transfer, the data that's moving between your device and the person and the actuator and the sensor and all of that. You don't want that to be compromised or changed. So it really, I mean, I can't make a recommendation, because it really just depends on what the device is, the complexity of it, the size, what the data flows are. Essentially, I think is really where I would define it.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there, Joe.
Okay, so I'll have one more question that's a little bit more high level. Maybe I'll start with Garrett, from your experience with some of the deficiencies and some of the pushback from FDA. So the rule obviously applies to new products. It's very clear. What do you think the FDA will be doing to handle devices that are already in the market that can potentially represent a risk? And how do you think the FDA will go backwards towards these devices? And when do you think the FDA will start doing that?
I couldn't answer that completely. I think it's probably to remediate existing design history files, to generate all of the artifacts that are needed for submission and review that would be in compliance with the existing cyber, the new cyber, and the existing software is a huge, tall order. I'm not sure when and how much. And to be honest, straight up, we haven't got too much experience. We're nearly always pushing part of new product development as well, so we don't have too much exposure to legacy products as well, because we're product development people that develop new stuff and push it out. So I wouldn't have too much experience on it, unfortunately, Joe.
Okay. I think one thing I would say from listening to FDA over the last few months, they are mindful of this. They are going to consider it. I think one of the things that you should be careful of, if you're going to be sending in an update to FDA, or you're going to issue a letter to file, or there's some type of change in your product, maybe it's a new indication, you will be expected to have this information in place. So I think that's part of how FDA is going to start to catch some of the legacy devices. And we have heard that FDA is starting to look at tools themselves, technology themselves, to help in their analyses and their procedures and processes. So I think you can expect to hear more about that from FDA. But I definitely think if you're going to be putting a letter to file, or you're going to be changing your technology, anytime you're going to be going through any type of submission to FDA, you should be able to expect FDA to be asking for your cybersecurity information as well. Let me just see here if we've got another question here. in addition to SBOM and cybersecurity, what are the other documents that are expected and are anticipated as crucial for cybersecurity? That's a good question. I'll turn that over maybe to Garrett and to Catherine. Start in that order.
I would say, again, it may not be specific to the documents, but if you look at the secure product development framework and the topics that are in there, that is absolutely something that they're going to be benchmarking you against. So if the documentation that you have does not describe, if there's a gap associated with what the documents are expressing to one of those steps in the secure product development framework, you are going to have deficiency components in your outlined by the FDA, would be my view. And I don't know if the title of the document is specific, but each of those, they're giving you the processes, the activities to go through in there. So it's a very useful template for what you need to document. Catherine.
Well, I can only really comment on the cybersecurity risk management side of it, and really what we covered in the slides today is some more detail on it. Is once you've got the software bill of materials, you know what vulnerabilities you have, whether in the third party or your own. You may find vulnerabilities in your own static code testing, but you really need to be able to supply the information that you understand the vulnerabilities, you understand the threats that can exploit them, you have looked at the impacts that they can cause, and you have the controls in place. Some standard controls. You have controls that comply to a standard. So that's kind of the core of what you need to supply. So keeping the SBOM and understanding that you've got a full and complete SBOM, you've got a full and complete risk assessment of all the potential vulnerabilities and threats. And then looking forward, then when I think of the life cycle, you're going to have your plans in place for how you're going to monitor your vulnerabilities of your third-party components going forward. You're going to have your plan for how you're going to take updates from those companies and update your device, how you're going to push those updates out to your customers as well. So they're the type of documents I think that are going to be crucial, because this information, cybersecurity, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not there just when you submit it first. It's really the most important, because at submission, you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know in the future. So what you have to do is show that you've got a plan to keep this monitoring up and to keep control over vulnerabilities that come in, both for your device and to be able to move them on to the users of the devices that you have. So I think that for me would be that's kind of the full life cycle, almost the full chain of what you need to do from a documentation cybersecurity point of view.
Great, thank you. I guess what I'll do, I think that is getting to the end of time. I guess I'll turn it back over to Nicole.
Hi there. Great conversation. We do still have 5 minutes, Joe. If you want to keep taking questions, feel free.
Okay, sure. I think we got one more question here.
Awesome.
So here's a technical question, Garrett. So maybe I saw Killian join too, so maybe he can jump in. This is a multi-parter. So what would you consider a person should do with a serial communication to make that communication safer on the programming side? Are there certain things a person could do to prevent an adversary from manipulating serial devices in case of a breach for the software, or at least minimize the threat?
I don't know, Killian, are you online? You're going to have to help me out with that one.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Great. So it is a good question, and it's a tricky one. So Let's go through it. Okay, so what would you consider a person should do with secure communication to make them safer on the programming side? Now, no matter what, once there is any interface at all, any serial comms possible, FDA are perceiving that this is now potentially exploitable. You know, this is a port or an interface through which the device could be exploited. So one of the main things I always think about is just actually trying to minimize the ways in which somebody can even access any sort of serial ports, any communication. And then if they do manage to actually even physically get access, then I'm always thinking about what can you do from a defensive programming perspective to try and actually minimize the damage that can be done. So applying a defense in depth strategy. Imagine, you know, if we can't already block off through, you know, physical access, you know, if it is possible something might get access, then what else can you do to ensure there's certain things can only be done through authorized accounts? You know, what kind of, you know, blocking can you do there? And then maybe to the point as well of how much can you safeguard what access, you know, certain comms does have to other critical parts of your system. So as Garrett was mentioning earlier, when you take a very critical look at your architecture, you can actually start to think about what interfaces can even exist internally through which you can try and safeguard or defend people getting access to the critical elements or the higher risk elements of your system, if that all makes sense. So if there's certain things a person can do to prevent adversary from manipulating serial devices in case of breach of software, yeah, that's basically it. There are, you know, just, you know, trying to apply as much technical obstacles, I suppose, is the only thing I can think of, to try and just minimize the damage that can be done should somebody get access. Yeah, if that all makes sense. Hope that answered the question.
I think, look, we'd be happy to follow up on that. It's quite a deep technical question, and it would need to be unpacked quite a bit to give you a meaningful answer. And if that individual would like to contact us directly, we'd be happy to expand on it further. It's because it's a significant one.
Yeah, I think we'll go through and we'll try to recapture some of the information as well that we've shared and include that in a follow-on. And I'll work with Nicole to figure out how we can make that happen. Maybe we send that out too as a follow-on as well to the folks that are on the call.
Yep.
So maybe one more technical question for Killian. So if a USB port is disabled and that's not strong enough of a mitigation, should we be focusing more on strengthening the disable functionality, or assume that the disable can be exploited and include security considerations beyond the intended scope?
Yeah, it's a good question. So disabling the USB port might actually be strong enough depending on what your system is doing and depending on what a threat actor can actually do through that USB port. If you can make a strong enough case to it for just disabling the port to the FDA, and can be sure to actually show your rationale behind it. You know, all the threats that you can see through your threat modeling and, you know, the mitigation you've put in place just by disabling it. If you can prove or you think you can rationalize that is good enough, then that may well be fine. But under the assumption there, you're saying that actually maybe disabling it is not a good enough mitigation, won't be accepted on its own, then what I always think about here is if I'm actually trying to develop a device that my own grandmother or my own mother is going to use, and I know in this day and age what threat actors can actually do, I'm always thinking through what more do I want to do here to prove that this is as safe as possible? What more do I need to do to try and actually, you know, not just convince the FDA to get this over the line, but actually have that firm confidence that this device is as secure as possible. So that might be a few different approaches then. So yeah, one is possibly just strengthening disable functionality, make it harder for someone to actually get access to it in the first place, and make someone actually harder to actually be able to get in and re-enable it or use that port. And then on top of that, like I said, with the defense in depth strategy, imagine that did happen. How much damage could a threat actor actually do should they be able to re-enable that port? So you can, again, like I said, safeguard certain critical functionality from being doable or accessible through that port, add in additional authorization type controls to try and just minimize who can do what. But yeah, that's the approach I always take, is just, you know, do I feel this is good enough for use? So it's not just trying to tick the box the FDA, is making sure that, you know, the likelihood of something going wrong in the field when somebody really starts tampering with this is absolutely minimized.
Now back to Nicole.
Thank you so much. See, I knew we had a few more minutes for those important questions that were out there. Man, what a lot of fantastic information. I feel like we could keep going. Thank you to everyone on the call for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers from Novalia and BlueBridge Technologies. Really appreciate your expertise and your support of this webinar. We cannot bring this, expert content to our membership without support from organizations like you. So thank you. There is a follow-up webinar that's going to cover some of the same information, but potentially dive into it from a different aspect, coming up on November 30th from Novalia and a different partner. If you want to check that out, visit massmedic.com/events, and you can see that event as well as lots of other upcoming events. And as we mentioned, a recording of this webinar and the slides are going to be sent out to everyone who registered. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.